Good afternoon, a little short. My name is Dr. Alexis Patterson, and I'm here this afternoon to introduce Dr. Maribel Santiago. Dr. Santiago is an assistant professor in the Department of Teacher Education and adjunct assistant professor in the Department of History at Michigan State University. After obtaining a dual BA in History and Chicano Studies and a Master's of Education from UCLA, Dr. Santiago taught high school social studies in Watts at a neighborhood in Los Angeles. And I should say that she taught with Dr. Danny Martinez. They go way back. She also earned a master's in history and a PhD in curriculum studies and teacher education, both from Stanford University. Dr. Santiago is an interdisciplinary scholar who merges teacher education and curriculum studies with history. She specializes in Latino history education, a field she is developing. In particular, her work is concerned with how Mexican-American contributions are taught in U.S. history classrooms and the consequences of such depictions. Dr. Santiago is currently the program chair of the National Council for Social Studies Scholars of Color Forum and is also a National Center for Institutional Diversity, exemplary diversity scholar. Say that 10 times fast. And just on a personal note, Maribel and I started at Stanford together. We were in the same cohort and we actually graduated together. And a common theme across our dissertations that we did not plan was that it takes a village to, the old adage is it takes a village to raise a child, but it takes a village to get through a dissertation and a PhD program. And one thing that I can say is that Maribel was a huge part of my village, and she embodies that statement, not just as a receiver from the village, but she gives so much in terms of her resources, in terms of her time and support, not just to me, but to the broader community at Stanford and I'm sure at Michigan State. So it's my pleasure to welcome her and to hear her presentation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Santiago.
I have to say it's a real pleasure to be introduced by Alexis because she was my ride or die at Stanford, so we've come a long way. So good afternoon, everyone. I gotta move this too, I'm kind of short, even with heels. I don't know how incredibly different our presentations could be. To go from digital literacy to historical literacy, it's like from text to internet, it's just so absurd. But I think there are some common threads throughout that we could talk about at the end. So this presentation is part of a larger project that considers how we teach the contributions of Mexican Americans in the historical context. And so today I'll focus on a manuscript that's still in progress, so I'd be happy to hear any of your feedback. Particularly, I consider how Latina students use multiple lenses to make sense of Mexican American discrimination in the past. Now, to put this into context, I want to share with you a classroom conversation I observed. The teacher asked her students if they agreed with the practice of segregating Mexican Americans in the 1940s because they allegedly didn't speak English, and they allegedly slowed down the white students. And so the students responded with, "You're going to get irritated. I would get irritated if someone from somewhere else, I'm not racist or anything, but I would get irritated if you had to stop the whole class just to talk to that one person." Well, when I was in middle school, there were students who didn't speak English, and they would split them up into our classes, and it would be so irritating waiting for them. Now, some may be surprised to know that this conversation occurred between two Mexican-American students. What makes it particularly jarring is that we often assume that people of color would oppose segregation, for one, and then, especially when it's enacted against their same racial or ethnic group. We assume that students' shared racial or ethnic background would help them identify with the discriminated group. But that reality is a lot more nuanced than that. And in fact, what I'll share with you today reveals how students of color, their experiences might help them see racial and ethnic discrimination in the past, but that those same experiences might also reinforce stereotypes about EL students. So I'll first begin situating my work within the larger field of social studies ed. I'll share with you my methodological approach for the research questions and kind of share snapshots of some evidence that highlight the two major findings I'll share with you in a minute, and I'll end with some contributions to the field. So, to understand how students make sense of discrimination, I consider research on students' racialized identities and how it influences their interpretation of US history. So for example, Black and Mexican American students, their experiences with discrimination, it may help them question the accuracy or be more critical of US history curriculum. And oftentimes it's because we associate US history with this narrative of progress and their experiences don't connect to that. Yet not all students of color see history through the same racialized lens. Cuban American students, Korean American students are less likely to be critical of US history when they haven't had those same experiences of prejudice. But using one's experiences to make sense of history may have its limitations. We don't see the world in the same way as people in the past did. So when students apply their experiences with race or ethnicity to their analysis of the past, they use present-day notions of race, even though those past racial constructs function differently. And so this type of presentism can be incredibly problematic. For example, by today's standards, Irish Americans are considered white. But in the 1840s, the same negative stereotypes that are now associated with blacks or were associated with blacks were also applied to Irish Americans. So in this instance, applying their present-day notions about whiteness to analyze Irish American discrimination would be of little use to students. The challenge then is to move students from presentism towards contextual historical empathy. Now this requires that students place historical actors, their social practices, and those values in its historical context to understand the way it occurred in its time and place. To understand how students make sense of Mexican American discrimination in the past, I consider how they use their personal experiences to analyze the unique racial and ethnic circumstances of a different time period. Now my work is rare in that it brings social cultural perspective to historical thinking, specifically historical empathy, and these are two genres that seldom meet together. Now I argue that bringing these two fields together might help us develop a conceptual framework for understanding how to better teach race and ethnicity in history classrooms. So specifically, my question considers what role do students' racialized lenses play in the development of historical empathy? Now to answer this question, I observed a charter high school in the San Francisco area. For 6 weeks, I looked at two 11th grade US classrooms. And during that time, I focused on a history lesson on Mendez v. Westminster, a 1940s case of Mexican American discrimination. So in 1945, for those of you who don't know about Mendez, in 1945, the Mendez children were denied admission at their local school. They were told to register at the quote-unquote Mexican school. Now, what followed was a class action lawsuit that ends Mexican American segregation, but in doing so, Mexican Americans become legally white. And as such, you couldn't segregate Mexican Americans whites from other whites. It also left segregation practices against Native Americans and Asian Americans, and it upheld language segregation on the premise that it was pedagogically sound to segregate Mexican Americans because they allegedly didn't speak English. So in addition to the field notes, I also analyzed 177 student work samples. I interviewed 15 of the 29 participants, overwhelmingly Latino, which represented the diversity of the school. Now, the findings reveal that students' experiences in the present help them make sense of Mexican American discrimination in the past, but not language discrimination. So, students' lived experiences help them make sense of the strategic nature of employing racial whiteness. So across the 3 data sets, there were 50 instances in which students cited white privilege. And in 16 of these instances, students identified and discussed advantages that Mexican Americans gained in being legally recognized as white. And this was most visible during a writing prompt that the teacher gave them, a pair share, where students were giving discussing 1940s racial categories. And the writing prompt read, in the 1940s, the US government recognized 5 racial categories: Black, White, Indian, Asian, and Mongolian. If you were a Mexican American in the 1940s, which would you choose and why? Now the students replied with, white because white people got everything, white because they were treated better, white because they had the most rights, white so I wouldn't be discriminated against and I could get a job, white because you have more benefits, white because you're superior and have more opportunities, white because white people could go to school and have more education, white so I can get a better education. Now the students' comments in their work samples are very succinct. I mean, it was a pair share. But they nonetheless captured the understanding that whites have a set of rights that people of color don't. And so of course they referred to better education, job opportunities, and in the conversations they also referred to not being racially profiled. This also happened right around the time of the Trayvon Martin case. And although segregation laws no longer exist, white privilege and supremacy continue to function in the US, and it's one that the students recognize. So they were able to draw on their present-day experiences to explain why Mexican Americans in the past would claim legal whiteness. Of course you were, it gets me access to better schools. Now connecting their personal experiences with those historical actors facilitated students admitting that they too would employ the same strategy to gain benefits for themselves and other Mexican Americans. And that became much clearer during the interviews. So for example, when asked about why Mexican Americans claimed white status, Noemi says, claiming to be white was just a cover for Mexicans. Being white gives you more opportunities, but it's not like you're really white. I think it's because of segregation. You can't segregate whites and whites, you know. If they didn't know that you were Mexican, then they weren't going to get segregated. So Noemi understands that being white comes with a set of advantages, or she calls them more opportunities. Noemi also recognizes that when Mexican Americans claimed white legal status, it was a strategy, or she calls it a cover. Mexicans aren't really white. They're just claiming to be so they don't get segregated. And the students realized that the Mendez attorney employed a legal tactic, that it was a strategy, that they didn't really turn their back on their heritage, but it was just a way to subvert the racial hierarchy to gain entree and access to a better education. So when students' experiences with race and ethnicity parallel those of the historical actors in the past, they empathize with those who claim to be white to gain access to better schools. Now, one possibility for why students empathize with the historical actors is that they identified with the racial discrimination challenges they encountered. So going back to that previous writing prompt, the teacher asked, what did you write in your responses? Ricky says, I would say Asian or Indian because we all kind of look alike. Galilea, Black, because we're both equally discriminated against. Jezebel, yeah, because we're both segregated. So these three students all used first person. Instead of saying Blacks because they're both discriminated, they say Blacks because we're both discriminated. And the use of we indicates that they're part of this common group, that they align themselves with the historical actors because they share this history of racial and ethnic discrimination. Now, using first person was incredibly rare. In the 810 minutes of classroom conversation I observed, there was only 2 instances in which students used first person, this being one of them. So the first person represents a shift in the conversation from a neutral one where they saw themselves distant from the historical actors to a more personal tone in which they reflect their experiences with race and ethnicity. So in this sense, the present and the students' experiences were an asset in understanding past Mexican-American racial discrimination. But this wasn't necessarily the case with language discrimination or language segregation. So overwhelmingly, students impose their present understanding of language ed onto the 1940s. They frequently and incorrectly assumed that those who were being segregated were Mexican immigrants who did not speak English. So when Liz discusses 1940s language segregation, she says, that still happens today. We need to provide support for people who aren't as proficient in English. It just means that they're receiving more support because they need it. That happens not just with language, but also with other academic subjects. I don't know if they were necessarily being discriminated against and being thought of as less. So Liz connects the present with the past when she says that still happens today. But what she's really describing is English language instruction, not language segregation. So because she imagines that language segregation in the past looks like EL instruction today, she also makes the mistake of assuming that 1940s Mexican Americans, like some Mexican immigrants today, don't speak English. She also assumes language segregation would be supportive, similar to the kind of subject matter support students receive today. And well, if it's supportive, then maybe they didn't discriminate against Mexican Americans. So what Liz didn't realize is that she was actually siding with school district officials who wanted to segregate Mexican Americans because of the same reasons she outlined, that it was in the best interest of students. Liz also didn't realize that in 1940s California, she too would have been segregated. And so because Liz conceptualizes language segregation as an English language instruction, she didn't see how language segregation was a discriminatory practice against Mexican Americans who spoke English. So Liz, in part, seems to favor language segregation because she didn't identify with those who she thought would be segregated, Mexican immigrant students. This is who she's conceptualizing would be segregated. So for instance, in the quote that I shared at the beginning, Leticia says, I would get irritated if someone from somewhere else, but I'm not racist or anything, right? But I would get irritated if he had to stop the whole class just to talk to that person. And Noemi says, when I was in middle school, there were students who didn't speak English, and they would split them up into our classes, and it would be so irritating waiting for them. So Leticia and Noemi use first person again, but not in the same way that it functioned before. Instead of using it to identify with the historical actors, they use it to differentiate themselves. And you see that when they say I, and then distance themselves from them Mexican Americans. They use the use of we in the racial discrimination example indicates that students could consider themselves part of the same group, but in this case, they were othering themselves. And you see that from somewhere else didn't speak English and were therefore EL students. So they didn't see themselves reflected in the group that would be segregated because they didn't consider themselves EL students, despite the fact that some were immigrants or former EL students, and that all of them spoke Spanish. Now, one of the reasons I believe students may have distanced themselves from foreign-born EL students is because of their low social standing in school settings. The division between second-generation immigrant students and recent arrivals is a source of tension that has been documented primarily in Asian communities. Known as interethnic othering, Pike and Dang talk a lot about this, is the practice of denigrating the traits and practices of recent arrivals, and so that students can construct themselves as distinct and superior and distance themselves from recent immigrants. So students use their US socialization and English proficiency as status symbols to establish themselves above immigrant students in this school social hierarchy. And fresh off the boat is often used as the example, but in Spanish, being labeled as a chuntaro or a chunti would be the equivalent. So the students seem to favor language segregation because they didn't associate themselves with those immigrant students. When confronted with the issue of language as a proxy for racial and ethnic discrimination, their understanding of and experiences with EL instruction and EL students interfered with them understanding the past. So in this instance, drawing parallels between their present experiences and the past hindered their analysis of Mexican American discrimination. So collectively, these findings shed light on the nuanced ways in which students' experiences with race and ethnicity and language play a role in the historical analysis of Mexican American discrimination. Students' experiences influence how they conceptualize not only who will be discriminated, but also whether in fact it's discrimination at all. So students' conceptualization of Mexican Americans shifted depending on the type of discrimination that was being described. When Mexican Americans were segregated for not being white, do students categorize them as a racial group? But when Mexican Americans were segregated for allegedly not speaking English, the students recognized them as a foreign-born Spanish speakers. The students didn't see themselves as the same discriminated people, but rather as distinct groups. So students strain to identify the racialization of language, how Spanish has become a marker of Mexican American identity and a way to categorize them in seemingly benign ways. They were essentially blind to how language functioned as a proxy for racial discrimination. So I challenge the assumption that Latino students are more likely to empathize with Latinos in the past because of this presumed shared experience. The students don't have one universal Latina experience. This is why students could draw from their understanding of race and ethnicity to understand Mexican American claims to legal whiteness as a strategic decision. Yet, at the same time, struggle to apply their knowledge of EL instruction to understand how language was used to condone discrimination against Mexican Americans. So students' experiences with race and ethnicity do matter, but so do students' ideas about language and their intersection with immigration. Thus, the assertion that students see history through a racialized lens is more complex than what we've been able to document thus far. So the students in this study saw history not through one singular Latina lens, but through multiple lenses. One is a racialized group that identifies with other historically disenfranchised people of color, and another as an English-dominant group that doesn't align itself with language minorities or racialized linguistic discrimination. And so each lens is tinted with distinct experiences that help students analyze and at times misinterpret history. Thank you.